Our next guest needs little introduction. Considered the preeminent Australian writer of his generation, Tim Winton is the author of 29 books. His work has been translated into 28 languages and been widely adapted for film, television, theatre and opera. Listed as a national living treasure, a few other Australian writers have had such a broad-ranging and far-reaching cultural impact, from the arts and sciences to environment education and conservation policy. In June 2023, Tim Winton received an Order of Australia for his distinguished service to literature as an author and a novelist, to conservation and to the environmental advocacy. I now welcome Tim Winton to give a keynote presentation titled Writing in an Emergency, Time to Step Up. Thank you.
Thank you for a very warm introduction. Wow, you look a rough lot. No wonder they take the glassware off you. It's an honour to be asked to give this address. I hope I don't screw it up. I'll crack on because there's probably an episode of Vera waiting for us all at home. In his recent book, which is terrific, by the way, Eating the Earth, former investment banker Justin Walsh says that in economics, as in other human affairs, pretty much everything is story. But he goes on to say, our storytellers in chief are entirely self-serving. Why is that? Well, it's because there's a silence at the centre of the yarn that they spin. And just to quote him, a nature-sized hole at the heart of economic theory that properly fails to value the natural world. Well, the consequences of that studied evasion are grave and evident. While the storytellers that Walsh is referring to are, of course, our policymakers and plutocrats, he could just as well be describing our writers. Because for the best part of 2 decades, our literary culture was largely complicit in the maintenance of that silence. Stings a bit to hear it from a money wonk, but Walsh is seeking to remind us that it's from the natural world that we draw our prosperity, and it's from the natural world that we must find a new story. The great poet Les Murray once said, "Religions are big, slow poems." Well, the universal and dominant religion of our time has been fossil capitalism. It's a cult that we need to break free of in order to find the courage to write ourselves a new poem. Early in my career, somebody took the great trouble to declare me a provincial writer. By then, I guess I'd written about 10 books, and there was, I have to confess, a bit of geography in them. Now, apparently geography was uncool, and unfamiliar geography, well, that was a microaggression. It seemed back then that the further you got from Carlton, the more mystifying and triggering geography became. So it turned out that I'd been trafficking in problematic terrain. One critic said that Australian writers' preoccupation with landscape had become debilitating and destructive. Apparently writing too much or too directly about the natural world made us rustic and reactionary. Well, in those days I was pretty well insulated from static and chatter. This was before the internet, when a hot take was something you got from Eileen's Eats after the Sunday session at the White Sands. And a bit like the hot takes of today, it was often a source of regret. But in the days before instant communication, time and space just had so much more heft. I lived a long way from the wellsprings of cultural commentary. I was separated from all that noise by a lot of geography. Several deserts and river systems, some cities, many rural communities, numerous woodlands, forests and savannas, and of course smack dab in the middle, and the Nullarbor, the biggest limestone karst formation in the world, which according to some should be a matter of no account to a contemporary novelist, but just between you and me, it kind of was. So from that great distance, by the time praise or insults arrived, they were already old news. The sugars had washed off the praise and the acids of the insults had evaporated. And look, I didn't really mind being called a provincial. I knew it wasn't meant as a compliment, but I tried not to take it personally because I saw myself as a tradesman. By that stage, as I said, I'd been making a freelance living for a decade. I was widely translated, my books had long been published in New York and London, but I'd had to fight really hard to ensure that the work originated here, that it was edited and represented first by Australians. And that came at a cost. So I was really conscious of all the layers of resistance and incomprehension that lay between my work and a broader readership. There were barriers of culture, language, and yes, geography. But as the environmental historian Jason W. Moore says, geography really matters. But crossing those barriers, I've got to say, was thrilling. And yet I was conscious that others had gone before, that I was the beneficiary of other people's labour. Stowe, Stead, White, Herbert, Wright, Keneally, just to name a handful. And in my teens, when I was reading these giants and first writing and publishing, I was convinced that I belonged to a generation that would outlive the cultural cringe. Because by the mid-70s, it felt that Australian writers had given themselves permission to dream big, to go hard, and to tug no forelock. They spoke in their own accent without apology, focusing unflinchingly on their own place and its people, no matter how weird those people and places were. Peter Carey comes along with the fat man in history, blam! And Helen Garner shoves Monkey Grip very politely under our noses, pow! And I cannot tell you how liberating this felt. And I wasn't interested in nationalism then, and I'm not now. But as a child of the working class, writing across the continent into a bourgeois publishing establishment, I was determined to give no quarter. And I guess that's what I so admire about what Melissa Lukashenko has done recently from different points of cultural separation. Like it or lump it, folks, she's saying, fuck yes, this is me, get used to it. And to that I say, huzzah. But there was a period when the cringe was supplanted by a peculiarly vexed form of cosmopolitanism. It turned out to be more of a rebrand than a progression, because at its root was the old anxiety. What will the proper folks think of us? Funny how the people that we mustn't shame ourselves in front of always seem to be from another hemisphere. For a while there, the message Australian writers were getting from the cultural race callers was no more gum trees, kids. No kangaroos, no awkward place names. As if what they were hoping we might produce was something unburdened by the embarrassing specificities of geography and vernacular. A friction-free experience, a cosmopolitanism of smooth surfaces. Best you don't sound too local, too regional. Good if your little town could sound like it's some sort of placeless burg. You know, maybe stick a bit of a whiff of Eastern Europe on it. You know, somewhere east of Kafkamata. Your protagonist might be called Kay, but please, no girls called Kay. And pile on the irony, bub, lest you come over all earnest. Now, this was the quest for the universal reached by the straightened road of uniformity at the cost of a bulldozed landscape. Your little story or your little poem, it could be set anywhere because place was now beside the point. Like nature, it was a fabrication anyway, right? Now, this is all so long ago in a galaxy far away when geography was being erased by acts of corporate bastardry and by academic abstractions. Back then, disciplines in the academy had become so siloed and specialised, it was perfectly acceptable for a scholar to be illiterate in any other field of inquiry outside her own. So while it was disappointing to hear cultural commentators recoil from the natural world, it was hardly surprising because, let's face it, they knew bugger all about it. Some of them struggled to believe it even existed. Such was the power of their ideology. So within such a dispensation, I started to feel about as welcome as a paleontologist smuggling fossils into a creationist theme park in Kentucky. Bear in mind, though, by this point in history, we were all already freckle deep in trouble. Planetary trouble. Peril that was both material and measurable. Because in the world beyond the silos, we'd only just survived a global energy crisis. We had a huge frickin' hole in the ozone layer. Consumption of fossil energy was exploding. Our local whale populations had been hunted to the very threshold of extinction. Our fish stocks were tanking. Our old growth forests were being logged to smoking remnants. And all over the continent, citizens were fighting to save species, landforms and ecosystems. And yet attempts by our literary writers to set the drama and the jeopardy of the natural world anywhere near the foreground of a story were being met with distaste and disapproval. I was raised on modernism. In that peculiar dispensation, the artist was a high priest of culture, but a pastor of no parish, absolved of any obligation to the civilian population, or the boobs, as Mencken used to call them, with unbridled contempt. As a student of the arts, I was raised on that contempt. Eliot and others, well, they reeked of it. Patrick White, to his great credit, tried hard to leave it behind, but it was kind of baked in. So often in modernism, writerly courage was restricted to experiments in form. With some very notable exceptions, writers largely quarantined themselves from politics, but sadly also too often from other human beings outside the cognoscenti. Back then their bad behaviour was rewarded, even lionised. Just think of all those mid-century man-children. And then along came the various sects that got lumped together as the amorphous church of postmodernism. It turned out it was supposed to be a corrective, a progression. It did make a lot of noise about its transgressive potential, but it produced a politics in the end that I think shrank ever more inward. And it puts me in mind of the sea anemone, a festival of dancing segments and tentacles advertising its very complex glories to the ecosystem. But at the first approach of a stranger, it withdraws all appendages and retreats behind its own sphincter. For all its talk of intersectionality, postmodernist theory didn't often intersect with the great unwashed. It so loved the people, but just couldn't trust itself to say the words. It was so suspicious of language, it had to settle for gibberish, a fresh level of obscurity the uninitiated could only ever experience as contempt. Still, postmodernist priests had a more developed conscience than their forebears, and I think that's something to acknowledge and to celebrate. But while they conferenced and theorised, verbing every bloody noun in sight, the world they might have ministered to was disappearing in a Gnostic mist of their own making. Things like language, truth, matter, these were not to be trusted. I guess in the seminar, the ideas being generated and endlessly elaborated must have seemed so potent and empowering. But outside, in the world of blood and tears, not so much. I mean, let 1,000 flowers bloom if you can afford the water. But in a baking world, when folks are hungry, wouldn't it be wiser to grow veggies? And I guess this is the nub of how we've spent our last safe years on the planet, where our efforts have gone in the humanities and in particular our literature. As things got dry, where did we expend the water? Climate scholars like Andreas Malm are scathing on this subject. Malm says that by reducing nature to a construct, postmodernists essentially collaborated in its eradication. Just as the biosphere began to catch fire, he says, social theory retreated ever further from sooty matter into the pure air of text. But, as the British philosopher Kate Soper points out, it's not language that has a hole in its ozone layer. You can go ahead and call nature a trope, a social construction that doesn't exist until we bring it into the world by our own conception. You just try telling that to a villager who's knee-deep in her market square in Kiribati, or the masked Australian kid fleeing the fiery apocalypse in a dinghy. As Andreas Malm says, if scientists had never discovered global warming, it would still be happening. Anyway, those dogs have barked, the caravan has rolled on, and here we are picking up the pieces. This decades-long refusal to look at what's in front of us, even as the world burns, is part of what Amitav Ghosh calls our patterns of evasion. He says that for too long, most forms of art and literature were drawn into the modes of concealment that prevented people from recognising the realities of their plight. He points to the way so many of us have been able to block out what he calls the urgent proximity of non-human presences. And I've been reflecting on this puzzling resistance here in our literary ecosystem. And I think it was about cheapness. Capitalism has always depended on the exploitation of cheap labour. Its most ruthless refinement, fossil capital, requires cheap nature above all else. And when cheap nature is exhausted, it moves on, just as it moves on to fresh meat when labour ceases to be tractable and inexpensive. And during the apogee of fossil capitalism, our literature played nature cheap, treated it as rustic, backward, inconsequential, as if matter did not matter. I think on this front, Andreas Malm's probably right. This was a period when many critics and writers collaborated with the enemy, mostly without even knowing. Whether we were still possessed by the old mechanistic dualism that made us, in our own minds, masters of nature, or befuddled by social theory that ghosted nature entirely off the page and out of mind, we fell for a story that was not true. In economic terms, nature had long become an externality, and culture followed that lead like a useful idiot. Now, of course, we understand that what was truly debilitating was this critical impatience with landscape. What was really destructive was that urge to turn our gaze away from the metabolic imperatives of ecology and the rift between us and it. Writing about nature, well, that was niche at best, regressive at worst. But history has taught writers and readers that foregrounding the role of the non-human elements of our world is not reactionary business after all. It's urgent, radical, and necessary. Amitav Ghosh calls the era of fossil capitalism the Great Derangement. He points out how hapless the literary imagination has been in coming to terms with this long period of magical thinking, an era in which we convinced ourselves that we could burn the past cheaply, indefinitely, and without consequence. And of course, that's left us in an existential emergency without parallel in human history. Ghosh says, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture, and thus of the imagination. And who, apart from the most dedicated denialists and profiteers, could disagree? Sorry, was that you, Tony? Couldn't resist. Delia Falconer, who I'm sure feels very differently about postmodernism and yet writes beautifully about the natural world, has suggested that all of us, whether we're writers or not, now find ourselves authors of a story we may not be able to escape. Those of us who are writers, though, well, we've got really difficult work to do, and we're pretty bloody late to the bushfire. Ghosh says that if the urgency of a subject were a criterion of its seriousness, it should surely follow that this would be the principal preoccupation of writers the world over, which, of course, it is not. I'm beginning to wonder if it might be the only legitimate subject to write about. Still, I guess we could all just get on the beers and watch RuPaul's Drag Race while the power stays on. Sociologist Carrie Marie Norgard might call that implicatory denial, which is just another form of collaboration. But I don't want to collaborate with our enemies. I don't want to run. I want to stay and fight. And like a lot of folks, and increasingly a lot of young people, I'm doing whatever I can to arm myself for the struggle. But friends and comrades, the work of not averting your gaze, it's hard and it's psychologically perilous. The data sets and the modelling gathered by the world's best climate scientists are viscerally confronting. The deliberate and successful campaign by the oil and gas industry to hide climate science from the public and to sow doubt and confusion to this very day is a crime against humanity on a scale I can barely process, let alone forgive. And the inertia of our politics on the biggest moral and material issue of our day is heartbreaking. So I feel scorched and I'm angry. But I am still hopeful. Not just because despair is the unforgivable sin, but because I have so many reasons to hope. Some of them, of course, are people I love, some who depend on me. But some reasons for hope I find in the work and the ideas of strangers, people who are gently and increasingly militantly spinning a fresh web of stories for us to live within. And some of those folks are writers, many are Australian. And I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the courage and the doggedness of those who fed my mind and nurtured my spirit in the last few years. Truly, they've held me in their web. They've kept me from falling. I've cried with Joel Gergis. I've raged with Paddy Manning, Jeremy Moss, Marion Wilkinson, Anna Crean, Steve Cole and Bill Hare. I've quaked with James Bradley, David Wallace-Wells and Kate Mildenhall. I've hoped with Michael Mann, Charlie Massey, Kim Stanley Robinson and, to my great surprise, Pope Francis. I've dreamt with Freya Matthews. I've refreshed my wonder with Julia Baird and Judith Lucy, and I've felt the precious solidarity of my friend Richard Flanagan. And I won't pretend I've come to terms on this matter. I am not sanguine, but I am to some degree resolved. For a while there, I thought, hell, I'm just a writer. Seriously, what can I do? But I came to see the evasion in those words, the cowardice even, as if my craft were nothing. The power and mystery of words, nothing. A readership spanning generations and time zones, nothing. If that's the case, what's my life's work been for? Sure, I'm only a tradesman, but is my labour nothing more than a paycheck and a pat on the back from Yarralumla in my dotage? Artists, we love to say that we serve the work, we honour the craft, we do it for love, and because we feel we must, knowing it's both a privilege and a shit show. But I've had to ask myself all these years, and in recent years, more urgently than ever, what about readers? Those strangers to whom my work might offer pleasure, consolation, soul food, courage. Don't I work for them? And am I not part of a cohort of workers who offer their labour to the same end? Not priests of culture absolved of responsibility, but a guild of strangers and comrades trying to bring meaning and beauty into a world where every decent thing is in danger of being commodified and all human potential is now in jeopardy. And look, I can hear it, I sound terribly earnest. Just don't expect me to be embarrassed about that or to apologise for it. Our current predicament infects my every waking thought. I'm afraid it colours my view of my friends, neighbours and colleagues. It's led to the awful realisation that despite my peaceable nature and obviously impeccable manners, that I have enemies, by which I mean powers and principalities that pose a threat to my grandchildren and their children and to yours, my friends. Forces that must be overcome, forces that we must defeat. The science says that the very best we can hope for now is a world that's harsher and more chaotic than the one that you and I grew up in. Whether you're in South Melbourne or South Sudan, 1.5 degrees of heating by the end of this century is going to change human prospects. That's the good news. We're currently tracking for about 3 degrees, and that's catastrophic. So business as usual means the obliteration of myriad species and the immiseration of billions of human beings. That means business as usual needs to be stopped, and if it can't be reformed, it must be overthrown. It has to be reimagined and retooled, and writers will not be exempt from participating in that transformation. No cultural sea change is going to be possible without us. What's this going to take? I'm not sure, but I've got some suspicions, and I'm forced to think every day of those lines from my late friend, the American poet Liam Rector. Change is slow and hope is violent. The turning required is going to be tough, and yes, violence will be done, at the very least to some of the ideas we have of ourselves. Is it going to be chaotic? Hell yes. Writers, like everybody else, are going to have to embrace new levels and new kinds of risk. Writers in particular may need to set aside some of our precious irony, because in a burning world, irony might be about as useful as a one-legged bikie in an ass-kicking contest. We may need to risk sounding earnest. I'm sure we're going to need to jettison some nihilistic tropes about the natural world to live and write as if matter matters. And that means thinking more organically, becoming more literate about the material lives and needs of ecosystems and creatures, accepting that higher consciousness does not make us angels by dint of religion, ideology, or technology. For we too are creatures. And this world is not our social artefact or our plaything. It's not our setting or our backdrop. It's not our way station on the journey to heaven or to Mars. It's our home, and it's our only home. And in the streets, and at the polls, and on the page, we'll need to fight to save it with language that reflects this organic reality with clarity, urgency, and humility. Now, that doesn't mean we've got to recoil from what's comical or absurd. Rest assured, there'll always be adultery. There's going to be sad girls, lost boys, and folks trying to find their way along that spectrum. There's always going to be stories of the past and the future, tales of identity and exile and war, sadly, lots of that. But to mean anything, to avoid falling into the category of opiates, these works are going to need to have context. On the page, we can't keep pretending that there's nothing beyond the scene at hand. Whether your character is in a bedroom, a classroom, a space station, or a bomb shelter, there's more at play in their lives than ideology and their personal feelings. Novelists and storytellers are not beautiful liars, nor are we thieves, so we shouldn't be bilking readers, soaking them of their time by knowingly deceiving them about the world they live in or the one their children will inherit. For these are our neighbours, they're family. They're not boobs or rubes. They deserve more than our cynicism, our irony, our cowardice, our contempt. And sure, our agency may be modest, but it is real. Like everyone else, we're going to need to be bold, brave enough to make some mistakes, make fools of ourselves. And yeah, we're going to have to break some shit, including a few conventions and some niceties, certainly some patterns of desire, as Amitav Ghosh says, but also very probably some of those powers and principalities, the politicians, technocrats, corporations, and media empires who threaten the lives and the prospects of our descendants. This turning of which I speak, it's not a daydream. Change is not just possible, it's already afoot in the streets and on the page. A couple of years ago, Delia Falconer published a haunting book of essays called Signs and Wonders. It's full of insights and provocations. If you haven't got it, have a look, it's terrific. And there's a singular image in there of writerly labour that's shot through with both modesty and agency. She sees writers as lyrebirds turning over the leaf litter on the forest floor. And I love the organic aptness of that. For when creatures and organisms are allowed to be themselves, to function unimpeded, they do work for the world, to their own ends, of course, but also for their ecosystem. They consume energy, but also contribute to the production of energy just by being themselves. So whether it's a lyrebird turning over leaf litter, a slimy mat of blue-green algae in a salt marsh, fixing nitrogen at the very bottom of the food chain, or a stingray ploughing up the sediments of a coral lagoon in the process we call bioturbation, these animals are participating in the labour that sustains the web of life upon which we all depend. The future of our world and our species is fraught. It will, I fear, be distinguished by diminution and contingency. Many organisms might have to work harder for less, including writers, can you believe? But Delia Falconer suggests that it may be Australia's the best place for writing about uncertainty and loss, thanks to a geographical imagination more tuned to damage and survival, and a history of colonisation that's left us already less comfortable with the land and its creatures than our counterparts in the other hemisphere. I also suspect the sheer difference in scale between geography and humanity here is going to continue to be a distinguishing feature. 65,000 years of human habitation notwithstanding, there's still much more nature than culture, and the scale of that overmatch is impossible to ignore. And while humans in developed countries now live a more physically denatured existence than at any other time in human history, on a planet that now supports more captive animals than wild creatures, Australia is one continent where you cannot claim to have seen the end of nature. Bill McKibben's masterwork, The End of Nature, was published in 1989. Seems such a long time ago. But its prophetic power stands undiminished, I think. The last line of his book has been a personal byword for me. The comfort we need is inhuman. But it pains me to see how in the years since, so many writers have used McKibben's cautionary title as a springboard to claim that we now inhabit a post-natural world. Jedediah Purdy is another American writer I admire. He says that it now, and I quote him, makes no sense to honour and preserve a nature that is defined by not being human. He believes that the natural world is now so altered by human activity that it's time, as he says, to add nature itself to the list of things that are not natural. In every respect, he says, the world we inhabit will henceforth be the world we have made. And look, while I understand his reasoning, I believe Purdy and others like him to be mistaken and defeatist. I guess if I'd been raised in West Virginia and lived to see the strip mining and the fracking, opioid dumping and crony capitalism that's poisoned that region, maybe I'd think differently. But I do note that Barbara Kingsolver comes from parts thereabouts. Don't see her waving the white flag just yet. And you might just say that's the lefty in her. I suspect it could be the evolutionary biologist in her. I too am from a region that's suffered grievously during our Great Derangement. WA is the only state in our Commonwealth where emissions are rising and don't look like coming down anytime soon. And of course, we're no strangers to crony capitalism. We just call it state capture. Our most protected species are oil and gas corporations. Even so, we are custodians of enormous tranches of country in which natural processes, by which I mean non-human processes, are still the primary forces at work. Places like Ningaloo, for instance, have experienced several forms of colonisation: pastoralism, the oil and gas industry, van life, Instagram. And it's survived them all. Despite every human imposition since invasion and settlement, its three interconnected ecosystems remain functional, intact and independent, which is to say, wild. Sure, that's a function of their geographical isolation, and the might of their inbuilt resilience, which is exceptional. But it's also the result of human efforts to support and defend their integrity, and those efforts include millions of words of science, polemic, diplomacy, insurgency, delivered as inspiration and exhortation. Without all that writing, Ningaloo and other places like it, name your place, Kakadu, Daintree, the Franklin, these places would just be another wounded remnant, another shadow place lost to business as usual. I guess I'm responsible for some of that labour, certainly at Ningaloo. I've written in nearly every mode: op-eds, stump speeches, funding applications, ministerial briefing notes, letters of entreaty to movie stars, musos, premiers, prime ministers, postcards to children, long technical submissions to the EPA, social media posts, stickers, banners, graffiti, and stuff in several respectable registers of what some of us still like to call literary writing. So I think I can honestly say that I've road-tested the utility of language in the defence of nature. Everything I've written on this matter has been founded on scientific data, but now and again you're forced to park the facts for a minute and resort to awe and wonder. Sometimes that's just the only way to break through the indifference, which is not just political, but cultural. Contending with a barrier between humans and nature, a carapace that most of us grow and many of us mistake for evidence of adulthood, that must be broached. Whether you're writing for a cabinet minister or a reader of fiction, you've got to soften the calluses of a lifetime and appeal to the open-hearted child in that person. And when you're writing in defence of an ecosystem, you've got to do this on a mass scale, because you might be surprised to learn that cabinet ministers don't always fear their consciences quite as much as the numbers. That's what they call you and me, the people, we're the numbers. And I know that Delia Falconer has her doubts about awe. Wonder, she says, rarely translates into action. And she asks, could wonder itself be a kind of self-administered anaesthetic? Ouch. Fair cop. I've been chewing on that bit of gristle for decades because I've so often trafficked in wonder. I just spent 3 good years of novel writing time trying to arrange a shotgun marriage between natural history and awe for the telly. Every waking minute of those years haunted by the horrible prospect that I could end up producing little more than nature porn, which is a tranquilizer I really do despise. But I've got to say that on balance, while the dynamic that Delia points to is real and is frustrating, her word rarely might be carrying too much water. Think about this. Novelists rarely write a good book. Even their best work rarely gets the audience it deserves, if it finds a readership at all. Medical researchers, well, they rarely make breakthroughs. Stump speeches rarely change government policy. Firebrands, well, they rarely spark revolutions. And yet, all these unlikely things, they do happen. And they happen often enough to keep us all at it. The lyrebird cannot comprehend the full fruit of its labour. Oftentimes, neither does the writer. You rarely live long enough to witness the change that you've helped create. You do the work in good faith, acknowledging both the smallness and the necessity of it, and you crack on. I don't have an instrumental view of art, which is to say, I don't hang the meaning of my labour on the blunt peg of utility. Believe it or not, I'm still reconciled to the business of useless beauty. Why? Well, because it feeds the spirit, the way wild places feed our spirit. But that doesn't mean that I've never yearned to feel the great wheel move, or that I've never felt it turn. Everyone's going to have their own metrics for what constitutes change. Some of us, to our great joy, discover that we've managed to change a reader's day. More rarely, a reader's life. A few of us will get to shift the cultural conversation. Some even change public policy. some topple governments, or bring corporations to account, which is much harder. Some of us have helped console prisoners, free captives, save lives, species and ecosystems. So I don't think it's folly to hope that the combined labours of writers and civilians can contribute to saving the biosphere. I tell you though, the three best ways to ensure the failure of such a project is to declare that words are powerless or suspect, the world is dead already, and that nature was something that never existed in the first place. The challenges we face are not simply matters of physics, wicked as those are. Before the turn of the millennium, Purdy wrote that Americans had fallen into a hopelessness that is inattentive to and mistrustful of reality. And this is 20 years before QAnon, Pizzagate, and the moronic gangster presidency of Donald Trump. But I think it was a stark forewarning of the patterns of evasion that Amitav Ghosh and others have written about so eloquently since. A big part of that hopelessness born out of such mistrust and inattention is evident, I think, in the way that we've turned our backs on the material and urgent fact of nature. Justin Walsh, our money guy, says that capitalism has been our dominant faith. It elevates sovereignty, individual sovereignty, and sanctifies selfishness at the cost of collective concern and the common good. Now, you'd expect our writers to have resisted an orthodoxy like that, but when I go back through my library, I'm not so sure. I'll start with the fiction section because that's my biome, really. I see so many stories from the 90s and the noughties with an unrelenting emphasis on interiority, narratives that focus on a single atomised individual, first person, present tense, of course. There's little or no reference to collective endeavour. If the natural world appears, it smells of terps, like a theatrical flat that's been quickly dolloped in as filler. It's always way behind the action. It's never the point of it. It's always object, never subject. And the engine of the story is situational, situations that are personal, social at a pinch, but never geographical or ecological. And without trouble, no story, right? But hardly any trouble that includes the non-human world. With some notable exceptions, say Richard Flanagan's Death of a River Guide, our stories were largely struggles of alienation of every possible stripe, except for our huge and hugely consequential alienation from nature. It's a huge relief to get to the poetry section and remember that our poets were ahead of the game. Happy to say they were way ahead. And you just think of writers like Judith Wright, Les Murray, John Kinsella, Mark Tredinnick, and many others. And of course we've had essayists who were exemplars, those who've gone before like Eric Rolls, Barbara York Main, Vince Cervanti, just to name a couple. Contemporaries like John Blay, Pete Hay, William Lyons, the two Tims, Lowe and Flannery, historians like Tom Griffiths, Mary White, memoirists like Kim Mahood, thinkers like David Tacey, visionaries like Big Bill Nighy and David Muljarley. These writers, all of them, helped us see the material world in which we live, where, as Muljarley used to say, everything is standing up, alive. More recently, what once felt like a maverick vein in our contemporary literature has begun to work its way into the mainstream. Perhaps history, which of course includes natural history, has educated our writers in ways the Academy did not. Because even in novels now, there's an organic literacy that's evident that was so much harder to detect in the work of previous generations. As if we're finally beginning to understand, as Jason Moore says, that everything humans do in our everyday lives and in the major political, economic and cultural events of our times is bound up with the earth. Now, an assertion like that's pretty self-evident today, but even 15 years ago, outside activist circles, it was a tough cultural case to make in this country. So I cannot tell you how heartening and exciting it's been to watch writers like Robbie Arnott, Alexis Wright, Laura Jean McKay, James Bradley, Kate Mildenhall, Greg Day, Jock Sarong, and so many others, including our shortlisted writers here, and of course, Connor. Congratulations again. All these people at work offering their labour to change the cultural geography. My hope that this labour feeds the culture enough to spark up our politics, and maybe I'm dreaming, but I think something's definitely happening. I'm not actually particularly exercised about what we call writing that takes proper account of nature. I doubt that it even needs its own name. But of course I'm thrilled that there are now prizes for nature writing like the one that we're here celebrating tonight. But whether they're writing poetry, memoir, contemplative observation, naturalism with a bit of elegance, science with some aesthetic chops, history with an environmental palette, or fiction that simply refuses to obscure geography, writers in so many veins and genres are honouring the mystery and the risk inherent in the organic facts of life, and to me that's a huge signal of progress and something to celebrate. Not all my colleagues are going to agree with me, but I think that many of us might share the sentiment in something that Amitav Ghosh scratched into his diary in 2002. He said this: "I do believe it to be true that the land here is demonstrably alive, that it does not exist solely or even incidentally as a stage for the enactment of human history, that it is itself a protagonist. What was once an object, a chattel to exploit and dismiss, has become, I think, our most pressing and intimate subject." Thank you.